your life and make it innocent.
Hi everyone. We can see that there's already people in the stream. Welcome. We're just giving people a little bit of time to join, and then we'll start shortly. Hi everyone, welcome to yet another Real Data Science meetup. Today we're joined by Steve Carnal, who's going to talk to us about AI ethics. But before we start, why are we having those pizza sessions? As you know, AI, machine learning, it's all based on what's happening in the community. The open source community is bringing us loads of tools and techniques and practices that we all use and love. And we at PA, we have about 200 data scientists, and we all use those tools. And this is our way of giving back to the community. Just to talk about cool subjects, the stuff that really matters, the stuff that isn't about product push, it's about what's underneath, what's under the hood, how does it actually really work. Today is going to be a little bit different. Today, no code. That may sound as a surprise, and it may be disappointing to some of you, but hang on. Today is about AI ethics. AI ethics is, we'll hear from Steve, is, in my view, a very important subject that we should not be overlooked. Hence, one exceptional Real Data Science meetup session around ethics. Welcome again. Steve, how long have you been with PA?
3 years, I think. Yeah, 3 years.
Okay. So talk to us about yourself and why are you qualified to talk about AI?
Yeah, so it's
AI ethics.
Good question. So I've been at PA for 3 years now. I think I came in originally as a data engineer, but I think in the last 1-2 years, what I've been kind of transitioning more into is a kind of full product developer, so building products for our clients that can, solve their problems, are reliable, automated, sustainable, etc. And as part of that interest, I've been kind of looking at the differences between a kind of experiment or an analysis you do, or a proof of concept, and a product that you can rely on for the rest of your, for the rest of the organisation's life cycle. And as part of that interest, I think, Willem and I, we were both asked to help an insurance client last year assess their data science function, where they are today, where they needed to be to start realising some benefits. And as part of that, we looked at how they were looking at ethics, and were they developing ethical products? Did they know how to develop ethical products? And we developed an ethical framework for them. And that was based on a lot of research that we did, looking at all the work PA had previously done, speaking to regulators, speaking to other clients, and we've tried to condense all of that learning into a simple, practical framework for developers like myself and other developers that they can apply throughout the life cycle to ensure that they're building justifiable products that will give the right outcomes that you can depend on as a customer or a citizen.
Cool. Thanks for that. So yeah, that puts you in my book as a qualified person, because this is a young subject, right? AI ethics, and I'll ask you what you define as AI ethics. But I remember the very first days that we did experiments using machine learning on large data sets. I think back then, we at the bank that we're working at, we had the freedom to do anything that we wanted.
Yeah.
the only caveat was that as soon as we wanted to put stuff into production, we had to go through the whole DPIA and can we actually do this and red face test, etc., etc. So this is a very young profession.
Yeah.
I think now looking at it, it feels like something that was kind of well, not passing the red face test back then. But I don't know, that's just a feeling and a feeling of what's happening in the market and what people tell us. How do you define AI ethics?
Yeah, it's another good question. I think the best way to define AI ethics is, I guess, a set of moral principles and techniques that you can use as guidance to ensure that the things you develop have not just a benefit for you as a team and an organization, and not just a benefit for your customers and citizens, but that what you're doing is justifiable, what you're doing is obviously legal, and what you're doing is giving the right outcomes and using the right data and using the right design, the right method, so that if anyone ever kind of challenged a decision that your product made, you could quite happily stand in front of that decision and either say, this is how we came to that decision and this is why we think it's fair. And it's not a perfect world by any means. Maybe you find out that actually we need to retrain the model or whatever, but you could at least demonstrate why it generated that decision and why you thought that was a reasonable kind of inference to make.
Okay, cool. And why is it important? Why in today's day and age?
Yeah, so I think AI ethics is important for two reasons. I think on the one hand, if you get AI wrong, the reputational, legal, economic, social risks are severe. The GDPR fines and penalties are quite drastic, and people may not want to use your company if they think you're doing dodgy things with their data. But on the other hand, I think the upside of getting ethics right can be quite a boon to an organization. If you get a brand as a responsible developer of AI solutions, that can help you attract new customers, and I think it can also help you attract new talent. So if you have the best talent, they want to do the right thing. People want to build products that they can, again, as I said, stand in front of and say, yes, I'm happy with this. So I think if you can get AI ethics right, you can avoid significant risk, and you can also, get a quite important upsides. Okay,
cool. And we'll see later that not everyone gets it right. There has been some examples of this not being done well. So in your view, if you paint a picture of starting with ideation, getting your data, wrangling your data, creating your features, training your model, testing it, validating it, and then putting it in production, that whole life cycle.
Yep.
At what point do you think you need to, or do you, in your professional opinion, do you think we should actually start thinking about ethics?
Yep, another really good question. I think the answer has to be always. It doesn't matter what you're doing. I think you always need to be considering, is this the right thing to do? Is this a legal thing to do? Is this a justifiable thing to do? And I think that the most important thing to think about is that, so if you don't think about ethics from day one, and you build your POC and you think, yeah, great, this POC is giving us good outcomes, let's start moving it to live. I guess one of two things can happen. One, you get to the kind of the go live checkpoint and you realize we haven't thought about ethics at all, and now we've got a mountain of kind of paperwork, documentation, validation to go through and produce to prove that this is an ethical solution. And so not only do you have that massive task ahead of you, or at least you should, but you might then go through all of that and then find, oh no, this is actually not an ethical thing to do. Like, we found that there's some variables in the data which are questionable that maybe we shouldn't use, and if we exclude them, actually our predictions are not accurate at all. So now we've invested all this time and money, and we can't actually use the solution we've designed. So if you had thought about ethics from day one, you could, identify the issues with the use case, develop strategies to handle those issues, and maybe you find out that you can't do this solution. Maybe it's impossible to do it ethically, and you go, okay, well, let's fail fast. Let's move to the next idea.
Okay, cool. And I'm sure there's going to be many discussions in the second half of the meeting. One final question: do you think that there is a different approach depending on the industry that you're dealing with? Are banks different from IT firms, from hospitals, from etc.?
Yeah, so I think no, I don't think it should differ across industries. I think every company has customers effectively or service users, and every company is handling data. Every company has a reputation to uphold and regulations to abide by. So I think all industries should be applying these types of frameworks. Having said that, I guess when you're working with particularly sensitive data, so protected characteristics, for example, I think you just need to be slightly more cautious with how you apply that framework. I think for me, the question is, because I'm a bit of a cynic, what's the risk of harm if this goes wrong? And if you're trying to predict search engine results, the harm is quite low. If you're trying to build driverless cars, the harm is very, very high. So I think the same framework applies, but I think you need to be more cautious when the data is more sensitive and the risks are greater. Okay,
so the framework stands, but you need to put emphasis on different aspects.
I think so. Yeah, and I think if you have a classic DPIA, it's supposed to tease out those kind of things, right? That what's the risk of misuse of this data? What's the risk of data leakage? So that a DPIA that sits across all industries. So I think similarly, a kind of fully blown ethical framework should sit across all industries too.
Excellent. All right, thank you very much. All right, so we're now on to the next item, which is actually revealing this AI framework that we developed. Run of today is very straightforward. We'll ask Steve to present his thinking, present the framework as it is. And after that, we'll have a Miro board that we use to do a bit of discussion around a number of scenarios. So stay in there. I'll hand over to Steve and take it away. Oh, and I'll be keeping an eye on the chat. So if you have any questions, just put them in the chat and I'll raise them for you.
Thanks, Willem. So just to recap what we're going to talk about today, we're going to start with a bit of background, then we're going to go over what is AI ethics and why it's important. I know we already talked about that a little bit, but there's a couple of extra points to add. Then we're going to go through the framework that Willem and I have actually developed and the core principles there. And then we're going to finish on some actual practical advice and some scenarios where this framework might apply. I guess one disclaimer that I'd like to add is this is a framework developed by a developer, so this is not a legal framework. This is a sort of development framework. So you should always get legal advice when you're doing this stuff. This framework they're about to show is very much from that sort of developer's perspective. Okay, and with that, let's jump into it. So just a bit of background. I'm sure everyone on the call is familiar with AI, but just in case there are a couple of people left wondering, what we're talking about is basically developing a function that you can map an input to an output and make predictions or prescribe interventions, make decisions about cases. I think Willem already mentioned AI is clearly a huge topic for all sorts of organizations, all sorts of people, and it's clearly a very powerful tool, but to take advantage of it, we need to use it and deploy it responsibly. And I think that's what I mentioned earlier, that for me there's a very big difference between an experiment and a product, and we need to develop the right products both for ourselves and for our citizens. And I think this is why I think AI ethics is such an important thing, because clearly we all have an understanding of how to develop an AI solution, but I think what a lot of organizations are going through right now is the process of how do we make sure we're developing the right solutions, and how can we depend on them and vouch for them, that sort of thing. I've got a diagram here about why is AI ethics important. I already talked about it a little bit in one of my answers, but I think it's important to bear in mind there's a sort of spectrum from avoiding harms to building advantages. So I think it's important to not look at AI ethics as like, we're just avoiding risk and this is all about bad stuff happening to us. I think there's also like the good side, like if we get this right, we can build a reputation as a responsible user of AI, we can attract customers, we can retain talent, you can identify new opportunities. So I think, clearly there's downside to getting it wrong, but I think it's important to remember that there's upside to getting it right, rather than, think of it as a sort of hammer to bash people's heads to open with.
Carrot and the stick, right?
Exactly, yeah. So this Venn diagram illustrates a framework that Willem and I have designed. As I mentioned before, we were working with an insurance client who asked for us to help them think through how they can apply ethics to AI development, and we distilled a lot of research and previous work that PA had done into this single framework. And the next slides, we're going to look into each circle of this Venn diagram in a bit of detail, and we have a much larger deck that goes into like a very low level of detail in terms of like actual practical, detailed technical practical steps, but we're just going to keep it a relatively high level. So the framework, there's 5 core principles. So in this Venn diagram, one is your solution legitimate? So one, is it legal? Can you actually do this by law? That's a pretty important thing to check. But 2, should you do this? You know, is this morally justifiable? Is this a reasonable thing to do? The next is your solution fair? So if I guess a non-informed person was looking at what you'd done and what you'd used, would they come to the decision that this is a fair product? Has it been designed fairly? Has it been implemented fairly? Are the outcomes fair? The next aspect or principle is bias. So is the solution without bias? And I guess there's a bit of overlap between fairness and bias. I think in this framework we look at fairness as a sort of morally defined concept, whereas bias can actually be mathematically and statistically defined and measured, and I think that's the difference we're trying to tease out here. But this principle again is about making sure that there's no bias in the actual data you're using. There's no bias in the methods that you've chosen. The next one is the solution accountable? So can you as an organization stand in front of this product and say, yep, we did this is why we did it, and this is how it works, and if you have any challenges to what we've done, then this is who you speak to, and here's the methodology, this is how it came to its decision, do you think that's right or wrong, and if you think it's wrong, this is what we'll do to fix it. Finally, is the solution sustainable? And this is actually the key one for me. So you've built a product, it works today, great, but how do you know it's going to work a year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now? Society's impression of what is ethical can change. New laws can be made, new technology can be released, you can start getting different data. So how do you build a system that sustains itself, or at least warns you, the controller, that there are changes coming and you possibly need to retrain or resample or take some sort of remedial action? Following from that Venn diagram, we have the actual framework here on this slide. So for each one of those principles, and sorry, you have to crank your head for this. We couldn't get it onto a single slide, all in horizontal. We tried, and for each principle, we've kind of listed the key practical steps that go with them. So for legitimacy, you see lawful basis, ethical permissibility, and so on and so forth. And again, we've got a much larger report that details for each of these boxes the practical steps you can take, but we're just going to keep it relatively high level today. I think the really, from my perspective as a developer, the helpful thing about this framework is you could almost use this as like a checklist at ideation to go, yeah, we've thought about, is this a legitimate thing to do? And we've thought about what the fairness considerations are. We've thought about bias, we've thought about accountability, sustainability, and on that basis, we're going to go ahead with it. So you fill in your DPIA, you get your data, you start working on it, and then you continually, go back to this checklist to go, yes, the data appears to be fair, or maybe it doesn't. There's some skew in it, and this is how we've mitigated that, and so on and so forth. So I think it's a very practical framework, and I think it could easily be kind of integrated in things like DPIAs or board reports to just kind of check that you are doing the right thing, and you're continually checking what you're doing against this clear framework. There's one additional thing to point out, which is on the far left, which is point 6. Without this, the framework is kind of weak, but it's that it's understood and practiced across the firm. So one thing we saw when we were doing our research where we thought companies had done this effectively was where they had launched a new framework for AI ethics and then gone to the level of cascading that down through line manager meetings to everyone in the firm, regardless of whether or not they were involved in AI at that time, so that you could say everyone has seen this and understands it, because you never know, for a couple of years down the line, possibly the data science team comes to your desk and says, we like to build a solution, we need your input, and you're aware of the framework, so you're good to go. Sorry.
And by the way, we are going to share some of the slides from this deck. So if you want to download this framework, go for it.
Okay, so we're going to go through these in a little bit of detail one by one. So legitimate. So this principle is about making sure that you can do what you're intending to do, and that you should do what you're intending to do. So before you start developing your solution, you should really have an idea of is this actually legal? Do we have a legal basis for doing this? In the full deck we list all the main legal bases, but this is mainly a case of being able to say either we've got specific consent from our customers or citizens to do this, or that by using AI to do this we're going to be able to provide an existing contract or service better, and not just better for us but also better for the citizen or the customer. I think one thing that also needs to be done here is to justify why you're using AI to do this as opposed to a person, and again that loops back into being able to say our basis for doing this is because it will make the service better for the customer, it'll be quicker, it'll be more accurate, there'll be less delays, that sort of thing. The second point is ethical permissibility. So should we do this? And I guess in practice this is a harder thing to do because laws are fairly binary, whereas ethics is a bit of a grey area. But I think that is where the rest of this framework comes in handy. So if you can prove that you've got a legitimate use case, so there's a benefit for you, there's a benefit for the customer and the citizen. If you can show that you've thought about the fairness considerations and you've designed it with fairness in mind. If you can show that you've identified the sources of bias and you've got a mitigation strategy. If you can be accountable and say this is the owner of this solution, and we're sure that we can defend it if we were challenged. And if you can show that you've got a plan on how to make it sustainable, then I think it's a much easier case of saying this is ethically permissible, rather than trying to sort of get into the nitty-gritty. I think if you have that clear framework, again, you just use it as a checklist to go tick 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 tick. There we go. Let's let's proceed with this idea. The next principle is fairness. So how do we ensure the system does not produce adverse or unfair outcomes? And I think fairness is a difficult concept to define, and certainly this is what we found with the client that I was talking about. One of their key questions was, we want to build fair products, but what does fairness mean? How do we know we've met a threshold for fairness? And what we recommend is something that's called a fairness by design approach. So you have your input data and output data, I suppose, your design, the outcomes you're going to produce, and your implementation, and you want to build fairness into each one of those aspects. So for data, have we sourced accurate data? Is it relevant? Is it timely? For design, are we using features and methods that are reasonable? Is it justifiable to use these methods? Is it justifiable to use these variables? Outcomes, are our outcomes, are they fair in terms of not having unjust outcomes for specific groups or specific individuals? Do they kind of split evenly across groups, or are there any skews there? And then implementation, have you implemented it fair? So does the team know all the kind of the issues that there are with the data? Does the team have domain knowledge to draw from within your organization or without your organization, so that they know how to build a good product? Have you implemented it, using best practice methods, and that sort of thing? So I think this kind of goes back to the question you asked earlier. Should we think about ethics throughout the entire life cycle? Definitely you should think about fairness throughout the entire life cycle, because even in the proof of concept stage, you're pulling data, you're thinking about designs, and you probably, even from that point of view, want to think about, is this fair what we're doing, and if it's not, how can we make sure it is and still get a good outcome?
Can I ask a question? Who makes the final decision on fairness?
Yeah, that is a good question. I think in the ideation stage, when you're trying to fill out your DPIA perhaps to get a hold of some real data, I think it's a discussion between the data science team, between the data owners, between privacy and compliance, to agree these are the steps that we're going to take, these are the considerations we think we need to be aware of. Is everyone happy that we've taken reasonable steps to ensure fairness? I think then when you're in the kind of development stage, I think the really important thing there is to do lots of validation of what's coming out of the system and what's going in. and then you can demonstrate clearly the results and say, yes, the data that's going in, it has these skews, these are the mitigation strategies, and this is what we've done, and this is the outcomes that are coming. And then I think before you want to move a solution to live, it needs to be signed off at, I guess, the highest levels of governance that you have for AI to demonstrate that, yeah, we're moving this product to live, and our entire organization up to the top level can stand by it and say, yeah, we believe that this is fair. And I would also recommend, for particularly sensitive data, maybe even bringing in external people to validate what you've done, to be transparent with the public or with regulators, to say, this is what we're building, this is why we're building it, this is the benefit we're going for, and these are the considerations that we've taken, and do you think that's reasonable enough or not?
Got it.
The next principle is about bias, so how do we avoid or mitigate bias? I think for me, the best thing is testing, validating the testing, retesting, and then automating the tests. So, there's I guess legion sources of bias. I guess there's some that we are intimately aware of, some we aren't aware of. I think when we're designing and developing our product, we should be thinking about how can we test bias, and how can we prove bias. So, has our input data been selected and sampled effectively? Is representative data going into the pipeline? Are we including, the most important variables in the final analysis? Have we excluded too much, or have we excluded important things? Have we avoided making subjective decisions about what we've done throughout? And another thing that I think is important is, have we avoided doing things to get the outcome that we wanted? And I think there are specific tests that you can write to test that against the data. You can script these things up using the right tool set, and then I think internally a team should test these biases. Maybe make changes once they notice issues. They should show that to someone who is not in the team, but maybe another data scientist that's not involved with this product, and confirm that they've handled these and identified these. So you validate them. I then think you want to continually retest to check, as you keep working, are we still meeting the standards? And I think where possible you want to automate these tests just to take that burden off the team. But again, I think it's a case of getting approval at the highest levels to say, we're aware of these biases, these are the actions we've taken, and this is why we think they're what we've done is acceptable and reasonable, and on that basis we're going to move it to live, and these are the things we've automated to kind of warn us when, I don't know, sampling error or important variables being excluded, so that you can show that the product's actually sustainable.
And how do you deal? How do you deal with bias that's just in the data? Because people just tend to like the blue ones, so there's many more blue ones in your data set.
Yeah, I think that's actually really difficult. I guess you can try and get more data. You can try and wait for different patterns that are overrepresented. You may also just find that we can't produce an outcome based on this data set due to the skews that are in it, and we can't get something accurate. So I think it depends on the situation, but I think usually what you would try and do is just try and work with the data you've got, or get new data to try and improve upon that issue. But if you can't collect any new data, if what you've got is what you've got and you can't get around the bias, then I think you need to have a think about, is it actually possible to do what we're attempting to do with what we've got? And if it isn't possible, then you need to move on and maybe come back to it further down the line when you can get new sources of data.
Okay, thanks.
The next principle is about accountability. So who is going to be responsible for the solutions and how do we explain them? And I think governance is clearly a key question, and I think when we were talking to the client we mentioned, and I've seen in other situations, other examples, there's a question about, do we need a specific AI governance structure? Do we need to create a whole new kind of structure for this? And some clients being worried about creating all this new bureaucracy. I would actually say ideally you should build it into the existing governance processes you already have. There should be a data governance board, there should already be a DPIA, And I think it's much easier to build AI into that because you should already have, frameworks that look at how we use data, what we're putting, what processes we're putting into live that affect customers or citizens. And I think AI ethics can slot quite nicely into that. Obviously, it really depends on the organisation. Some organisations might feel that they do want their own AI governance board, which is completely fine. I guess my opinion on it is it probably fits quite nicely into the existing structures that you have. I mean, in finance, I think a lot of financial services companies have model risk frameworks for the models that they already produce, and you can't use a model until it passes through the risk framework. And I think to an extent you could also put an AI solution through that exact same process. Maybe you need to tweak the model risk framework slightly because an AI model is clearly different to a handmade statistical model, but ultimately the fundamental things of what you're doing, you're taking data and you're trying to make a prediction. It's basically the same thing. So you just need to tweak what you've got so that it fits to AI. The next question is, how do we explain our solutions? So if someone challenges a decision that we've made, how do we actually stand in front of what we've done and say, this is how we came to that solution? And I think the main thing here is to be transparent about what you've done, and I think that's why things like DPIAs, although they can be taxing and onerous, they are important, and that's why this framework is helpful, because if you can say, at ideation, this is the checklist we went through and this is how we've answered each point, and therefore we think it's reasonable, I think that makes it a bit easier to answer. The other thing that I've seen recommended in research is something called agent mapping, and I think this is a good thing to do when the data is very sensitive, but if you have a big supply chain of data, so there's lots of steps in the process between the data being collected at source and getting to your team in data science, and there's people doing things to it throughout the process, something you can do is produce an agent map, which you're basically kind of doing a flow of the data, who has touched it, what enrichments have they done, and what did it look like when it got to us, what did we do to it then, and what model, what methods, algorithms did we apply to it, and then you can use that to go, okay, we know exactly what's been done to this data, we can probably analyse what steps have had the most impact on it, and therefore identify why the outcome that someone's challenging was created, and also identify where you need to make changes if when you look into that challenge the customer or citizen is right, it's wrong, and you should have done X, Y, Z instead of A, B, C. So I think agent mapping, it probably seems like quite an onerous task, but if you do get challenged, you probably have to do that anyway, and it's much better to have that to hand rather than have to do it retrospectively. But I can definitely see an argument for only doing that in situations where the risk of harm or the likelihood of a challenge is higher. Maybe when you're working with patient data or quite sensitive customer data, it's definitely worth doing, I would say.
Okay. One question around accountability. I can definitely see that when you're dealing with, when you're doing a new project, you don't want delays. You don't want yet another meeting to discuss should or should we not do this. So how do you prevent the data science team from being so cautious that they stay well within the lines of what AI ethics should tell them, and they miss all kinds of opportunities?
I think that is a good question. I guess the other side is how do you prevent the process being so restrictive that no one can get anything through? And I think, to be honest, the first step is when you develop this framework, or either reusing what we've done or making something of your own, is to ratify it with everyone involved internally, so everyone knows what the guardrails are. And I think there is a bit of a process of kind of testing it out and seeing what you can and can't do within those guardrails. And I think it's important to push the envelope when you're a data scientist, but to not push it too far. I think there's a degree of, like I said, just kind of testing out the framework, maybe amending it, maybe going back through the loop with teams to say we think this is too restrictive, or we're worried about the risks. I think when you do a DPIA, you can usually identify how high risk an idea is, or you should be able to identify what the risks are. If the risks are low, then I would recommend really kind of going for it and trying out. Maybe it turns out further down the line that actually there was some risk we didn't know about it, and that's why you want to make this process keep this process throughout the life cycle, and continue to go back to the checklist and make sure what you're doing lines up with the framework. But I think the other thing is that's why that other box that I pointed to is important. Everyone should understand the principles and how to apply them, and then hopefully everyone knows what is and isn't acceptable.
Yep.
So the last principle is sustainable. So how do we ensure these solutions remain effective and ethical? And I think the important thing here, I think I said it earlier, is models can drift, data can change, regulations can change, technology changes. We don't use the same technology today that we did 20 years ago. How do you make sure everything stays up to date? And I think in this way it's almost worth seeing an AI solution as part of the team. In lots of professions, people get certifications, they get qualifications. After a certain amount of time, they have to redo them because they have to stay up to date. And I think that should apply for these products as well, because in some scenarios, you're going to be augmenting human decision making with these processes. So I think it stands to reason that they need to stay up to date as well. What we recommend for that is, I think, 4 types of monitoring. So model drift monitoring. So this is something that you can very easily automate with, I think, most cloud platforms using MLOps, which we'll talk about in a bit. Societal monitoring. So, taking the step to check what does society actually think is reasonable. And I think this is partly a case of seeing things that companies have done that has been deemed unreasonable and making sure that you haven't also done that, but also just maybe even doing focus groups or just talking to your customers or citizens to say these are the things we're planning to do, what do you think? The third is regulatory monitoring, so keeping in contact with the regulators or the government to say this is what we're planning to do, are any regulations going to change, etc. When we're working with this insurance client, PA had just been to, or had just got the note from a meeting between the regulator and different members of the financial services industry, where the regulator had given their kind of forward look of what regulations were going to change for AI, what they wanted to see companies doing. And I think that's the type of discussion you want to be involved in, just to see what is the government thinking, what's going to change, how does that affect what we've done. And if you've got your clear framework that you've applied to anything and you suddenly realize, oh, okay, right, this is a new consideration, then you should be able to identify all the products you've got that are affected by that change. The last one we're monitoring is technical monitoring. So this is kind of what I was alluding to earlier, just checking that the products you have are still using up-to-date methodology. AI is a long-standing field, and I think for all fields, something we think is acceptable one day or is a reliable kind of method. 20 years later, someone does a study that proves that is not reliable and you shouldn't use that. And so I think this is, again, that kind of almost like that recertification process, but making sure you're kind of reviewing the models that you're using, the tool sets, the stacks, the methods, and checking are these still all up to date and applicable. So the next bit I wanted to finish on is AI ethics in practice. So how do we take this this framework and practically apply it? On the bottom of the slide, we've got PA's algorithm lifecycle. So from think big through start small and scale fast. And I think for every step of this process, we should be thinking about this framework. So when we've got an idea, thinking, should we do this? Can we do this? Can we do it fairly? Can we do it without bias? Can we be accountable? Can it be sustainable? When you're starting small and sort of getting close to production, again, going back through that loop, validating what you're doing internally, validating what you're doing externally, getting the right sign-offs, and then scaling fast, making sure that the product is automatable, it's sustainable, and it's continuing to pass validation checks. On this slide, we've got some actual activities that you can do to kind of apply these principles. Again, in the full report, we've got a much longer list. This isn't exhaustive by any sense, but this gives an idea of the types of things you can do. So in the think big stage, clearly DPIAs are important. Before you get access to the real data, you should be able to show, why you're doing something and why it's reasonable. Another thing you can do is called a model card or a product card. I think Google pioneered this approach, and it's basically a very lightweight document that kind of describes at a high level, what are we doing, why are we doing it, what's the benefit for us, what's the benefit for our customers, the citizens, what's the outcome, broadly speaking, what method are we using, what data are we using, and that's just a nice transparent way and lightweight way of documenting what you've done. So if you're in discussions with a customer or a regulator or whoever external, you could say, we're working on this, what do you think? And that is something, like I said, that Google have pioneered, and they've got some great examples of that that I'd recommend using. The other thing is the agent mapping against accountability. Again, the earlier you do it, the better. Obviously, you might have to update it, but definitely a worthwhile thing to do when there's a high risk. Another thing I mentioned was model and product risk frameworks. Exploratory data analysis, internal, external QA. So there's lots of different practical things you can do throughout the process, just to make sure what you're doing, aligns with the principles that you set out. And I think using tools like MLOps, using automation wherever possible, can kind of take the kind of manual burden off, and hopefully, once you get in the kind of swing of applying this framework, it gets easier over time, and you get used to the checkpoints that you have to meet, and you just become very comfortable thinking about ethics throughout the life cycle. That is all the slides I'm going to show.
Cool.
The next bit is we've got some scenarios which will require people to log into Miro.
Yeah, and for let me first address this question. For point 4 of the framework, what is the best practice for explaining the outputs of and being accountable for complex or black box solutions where the underlying logic of the AI may not be clear?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and this is probably the hardest thing to do, and that's why I think the agent mapping exercise is worthwhile, because you can at least say, this is where the data has come from, this is everything that's been done to it before we got to our black box. This is why we chose this black box, and this is what we're expecting that black box to do. And here's examples maybe of that working in other scenarios. This is what came out, and this is why we thought what came out was fair, was reasonable. And I think things like that and making that transparent is the best thing to do. Even if I guess you might get a scenario where you feel like someone's challenging a decision and you feel like you can't explain it in layman's terms. So I think it's really important to do, like I said, internal validation of your documentation of what you've done, so you can be sure that if you were challenged, you could explain it simply, you could explain it transparently, and you could stand in front of what you had done and say, yeah, I believe in this and I think it was the right thing to do. Maybe we have to make some tweaks.
So you won't say move away from using black box?
I think, to be honest, it is something worth thinking about. If you can only do this using a black box, is it actually worth doing it? Again, if it's a very low risk use case and you think using a black box is reasonable, then maybe go for it. But my general recommendation would be to keep things transparent, to keep things answerable, because there is always a risk someone challenges what you've done, and if you feel like you can't explain it, then that is when things start getting quite sticky. So yeah, it's a good question. Generally, I would say to avoid if possible.
Cool. All right. There's no more questions in the chat. I will share the link for everyone to go to, which is the link to a Miro board. The Miro board essentially has a number of scenarios that we all can comment on. So the idea is we'll give you a couple of minutes just to fill out some comments, and then we'll be back to Steve to discuss those comments and see if it raises any further questions.
Can I ask something?
Go for it.
It's more of a conversation thing. In terms of societal and regulatory monitoring, to what extent should societal monitoring fall onto us? Should it not go to the regulators and then we follow the regulators, rather than us having to transparent accountable from both ends.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
can you repeat the question?
Yes, the question, I think, and tell me if I got it wrong, was to what extent should societal monitoring actually sit with the regulator? Because it's partly the government's job to make sure what they're doing matches what the people, the constituents, think. Is that fair?
Exactly.
I think it's a good question. I think the thing I would say, without trying to be critical of the government or the regulator, is
We won't.
we can probably move quicker than the government or the regulators, because they've got a lot of stuff to look into, and it takes time to move, to keep regulations up to date with society. If we can identify that society today thinks what this methodology is unethical, then we shouldn't wait for regulations. We should just act now. But I do agree with the sentiment. Ultimately we should be taking a lead from the law, because that's black and white, the regulations. But I also think it's prudent to potentially take some of that work on yourselves and just keep an eye on what society is thinking and feeling, and being a bit more agile, because regulations can take time.
Yeah. So that's the point where it moves from us feeling this is a fair solution to no longer legal.
Exactly. Yeah. It's like going from we think maybe we shouldn't do this, so we stop, and then suddenly the regulator goes, you can't do this.
Yeah.
And luckily we did the monitoring, and we were already prepared, so we didn't do it, and we don't have to undo everything that we did.
Cool. Any other questions in the room? If not, I invite you all to come to our Miro board. You're going to share it on the screen as well.
Yeah. Bear with me one second.
Walk us through the scenarios. We've listed a number of scenarios, they're all up for debate.
So this is Miro on my screen for those in the room, and I'm hoping people on YouTube can see. Basically how this works is you can move around, you can hold down Control and use your mouse scroll to scroll in and out. If you scroll out enough, you will see that there are a couple of boxes laid out, and if you can move over to there, that's where we're going to be working on these scenarios. So I'll just give it a couple of minutes for people to get oriented with Miro, and I guess feel free to put any questions in the chat about how to use it.
Yeah, I'll keep an eye out on the chat. Yeah, it's in the YouTube chat. You don't have that. Let me share it.
Okay, I guess might as well make a start, and yeah, like I said, if anyone's got any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. So the first scenario we're going to look at is around legitimacy. So this is where we you look at, can we do something, should we do something? And I think I mentioned earlier, there are some fairly standard legal bases for doing things, and 6 of them are listed on the slide. So one legal basis you can use is to say, a data subject has specifically said to us they're happy for us to do it. Another one is saying doing this with AI is necessary for us to perform the contract that we have. Or you can say, doing this with AI is necessary to comply with a legal obligation. Fourth is, doing this is necessary to protect the vital interests of our data subjects. The fifth is doing this processing is necessary to perform a task in public interest. And the final is, the processing is necessary for the purposes of the legitimate interests pursued by the controller. So I think typically the first 4 are the most commonly used. So saying people are either, we've actually gone to our customers, asked them if they were happy to do this, and they've said yes, or sort of saying, this is a process we already do manually, and in order to do it better for ourselves and our customer, we're going to use AI, and that will help us perform the contract or meet a legal obligation or protect some vital interests of a data subject. So what we're going to do is I'm going to put some scenarios on the slide, which you can also see in the Miro. And I guess the question to the room is, and type into a sticky note on the Miro board, which legal basis you think matches the use case. So the first scenario, and this was a real use case from one of our clients. So there was a police force who were developing an AI solution to detect potential contraband in images, audio, and text files. So when the police are, going through cases, they get an absolute mountain of evidence in various formats, file types, and it takes a lot of effort, police effort, to go through this and try and identify contraband and evidence. So can they, reduce that burden and move resources back to, frontline staff by using AI? So I guess the question for the room is, which legal bases would you use for this use case? And what are your thoughts on whether using AI is legitimate, justifiable? Like I said, on the Miro, take a sticky note, type in your thoughts, and we'll discuss it in a sec. I'm going to give it a couple of minutes just to give people a chance. Oh, and you can see the slide below the box in Miro if you want to refer back to the bases. I can see there's a war going on for moving the box around. I'll just give it one more minute. Okay, so I think this is a pretty straightforward one, and I think, all the answers on the board make sense to me. So I think, it's a pretty clear case of this is probably both in the public interest. So we're saving police time and resources. We're getting them focused on, actually policing and investigating, rather than, the busy work of going through all this evidence and finding out what is and isn't important. I guess the question, should we do this? I would say absolutely yes. This is something that could be done. The risk of getting something wrong, the risk of harm from getting something wrong. So I guess identifying some evidence that doesn't actually turn out to be important. Maybe it wastes a little bit of time, but overall we've saved a lot of time. I guess the one thing to be careful of is what happens if we miss contraband, but I don't think that would be enough reason to not do this, because a human agent could very easily miss contraband, and I think with effective training you could still probably save yourself a lot of time and still produce at least the same or better outcomes. Okay.
There's a couple of comments in there as well.
Let me see. So one comment is, there is also a country cultural aspect to this. Germany may be very different from USA, for instance. I think that is a very good point, actually. So the legal bases I've listed are from GDPR, which is primarily in the UK, I guess. But I think regardless of where you are in the world, you should be figuring out what is our legal basis for doing this. Yes, the ones I've chosen are kind of more of a UK-facing set, but there will be legal obligations, and you should very much be meeting them. And the standard of what you should and shouldn't do, again, maybe that does differ across countries, and I think that's where that societal monitoring comes in, saying if you're a global organisation, in this country, this is what society thinks is acceptable, and therefore we either shouldn't roll it out here or we should roll it out with these tweaks. Okay, let's go to the next example. So again, this is another real example. We have an insurer that wants to use AI against existing marketing data that they already have and collect to identify which existing customers have a high propensity to buy new products. So it's about, you know, looking at the data you already have and targeting customers more effectively using AI. So again, same process. Put some thoughts on the Miro. Which legal bases do you think this relates to? Do you think this is something that you should use AI for or not? Or, you know, what risks might there be, if any? And I'll give it another 3 minutes. Okay, I think looks like someone's typing, but we'll get to that. So yeah, again, I think pretty much everything on the board I agree with. So there's a couple you could use here. I think since you're using existing data for existing customers, probably the best thing to do is go out and see if you can get specific consent for this. So just asking your customers, we want to do this, would you be happy with that? And because if they say yes, that's a pretty watertight, you know, that can't really be argued with. I guess the downside of that is it might take you absolutely ages to get enough consent to have enough data to put through the model. So as a couple of other people have put in the Miro, you might want to look at, you know, is this going to help us perform our contract with them or our obligations better? So you could argue, you know, we're going to target our customers with the products that are right for them. With better accuracy, because we're going to use this solution, you know, to look at what they've bought before, what they're interested in, what they've told us they're interested in, to give them a better service. And you know, you could also say this is going to reduce our agents' processing time by, you know, X many hours per month, and therefore we can get the agents to focus on the customers and taking care of customer calls rather than, working on marketing. I think there's one note in the Miro board which makes a really good point about this one, which is this has to work both ways. So you shouldn't try to push a product on your clients unless you think you really think that they need it. So if this product, you know, goes wrong, you know, makes predictions or recommendations, and you start spamming customers with opportunities, there is a reputational risk there. So you need to be careful with this one, because, you know, there is a serious kind of customer retention risk if you get this wrong. But, you know, if you get it right, potentially, you know, you can target your customers better. Your customers will get the products that they're interested in. You can save money, and you can, you know, reinvest some of that back into the service, and you know, everyone's happy effectively. There's another comment on the board, depending on the country. Yeah, so yeah, another good point, depending on the country. So in the US, interest pursued by a controller. Yeah, so this could very much be in the interest of the controller, and again, yeah, data subject consent. So now we've got the last legitimate scenario. You are a hospital organisation and you are already, you know, collecting patient diagnosis data. So you think perhaps we can use this data to build an app that can detect when patients are at risk of developing an acute condition, and off the basis of that, you know, let's go out and help them. before it gets any worse. So again, same question: which legal basis do you think you should use for this, and do you think you should do this or should not do this, and what risks might there be with doing this? There is a sticky on the board that just says "surely not." I don't think I disagree. Yep, so that's time. I can see a couple of people still typing, but please feel free to continue. Get to your tickets when they're done. But yeah, I think most people have got the right bases. So one, you could go to your patients and say, this is what this is what we want to do. This is the benefit we think this has for you. Are you happy with it? Again, might take a long time. If I were a betting man, I'd say they'd probably say no, but you can try that approach. I think the other legal basis is clearly, this could be of public interest if we can accurately predict when people are going to have an acute condition, and we can act on it before it happens. Then they don't have to go to A&E. I think someone has written, like I said, someone's written "surely not." I think I agree. I think this is a very risky use case, and you probably really need to think carefully about this one, about whether you should do it, and whether you can do it fairly, whether you should use that data, and whether it really, you could really stand by this product, because that is like super sensitive. The other note, I think that I saw someone said, risk of building biased AI, so you will have to use patient data for this, and data about those patients and what those patients have been diagnosed with. It basically doesn't get more sensitive than that, so there's like a huge amount of risk with this use case. So I'm glad a couple of people have called that out, because this is actually a real scenario, not one of PA's, but some of you might remember it. So a company called DeepMind, or Google DeepMind, developed an app using NHS data, to do this, to help predict acute conditions. And I think they believed that they did have consent to do it, or that it was in the public interest. Hospitals already collect this data; they already try and use it to do this type of thing. But when they were actually legally challenged on that, they couldn't actually, prove that this was an ethical thing to do. They couldn't prove that it was in the public interest, and there was quite a severe blowback for that. So yeah, this is one that I think is probably a bad one, but I think this is the importance of the framework, right? Because if you are fully accountable for your product, you are more than happy to go to anyone external to the company to say, this is what we want to do, this is why we're going to do it, and what do you think? And if they challenge you, you'll be able to explain, from day zero to day now, what you've done and why you've done it and why you think it's reasonable.
There's a question in the chat as well, and I'll just read it out. Is it your responsibility to ensure the customer has obtained legal consent from their data subjects? ? For example, what if the customer asks their subject a question that violates their legal rights?
Yeah, so I think this is I guess the issue with the consent angle is the the legal obligation and how much consent you have to go. I think when you as a team are trying to build a product, that is handling this type of data, even if maybe technically speaking you don't have the legal obligation, I think you still are obliged to ensure whoever's obligation it is that they have carried out as well. I think the answer to that question, it probably depends on the scenario, but I would say regardless, you are obliged to do it ethically because you're the person or you're the team or organization trying to do something with that data.
Okay, thanks. And let me know if that doesn't answer your question.
Cool. So the next scenario is about fairness. So let's say we need to, or we want to develop an algorithm that can assess a criminal defendant's likelihood of becoming a recidivist or a reoffender. And we've got a single data set of real data that covers 10,000 defendants over a 2-year period and whether they actually reoffended or not. And we've got an ID, we've got the crime that they committed, the date that they committed the crime, their age when they committed the crime, their ethnicity, religion, gender, so you can imagine some other features that we have, and whether they've reoffended or not. I think the question for this one is, what fairness considerations do you think there are for using this data set to try and predict whether these people are going to reoffend or not? Okay, so I'm going to start going through these now, but as I said, feel free to keep talking. So I guess I'll go clockwise. Someone has put there's a likely strong bias in the data, ethnicity, where they live, age. Bias also expected in outcomes from prior convictions. Legal system likely has bias. You cannot reoffend if given an extremely long sentence, for example. The data is skewed towards people with short sentences. Yeah, that's absolutely right. I would argue that this data is probably unfair. I think it's arguable that the justice system isn't entirely fair. So it stands to reason that neither is the data, especially historical. Maybe the justice system in a particular country is better today than it was previously. But when you're using historical data, you definitely can't put your hand on heart and say this data is definitely fair. And I think the other point is it reasonable to use these features? I would say probably not. I think almost every protected characteristic is in this data set. So without, if you exclude those features, you basically have a list of IDs and crimes and whether they reoffended or not. So it's probably not, a reasonable use case. And I think this is where the framework comes in. Checking, is the data fair? Well, it almost definitely is not fair, because we know, these types of outcomes aren't necessarily fair and they are skewed. Can we design it fairly? Well, is it morally justifiable to use these protected characteristics? Probably not. Are the outcomes going to be fair? again, the inputs are unfair, so it's probably unlikely that the outputs will be fair. And can you implement this fairly? I mean, maybe you could implement this fairly, but I would be amazed if you could still produce an accurate outcome while doing this, completely fairly. The next comment, hard to ask for consent. Yep, definitely. I'd be amazed if you could get contact details for all 10,000 of those people and then ask them for consent and for them to say yes. That definitely won't happen. Is the data biased? Yet we've already talked about this. It almost certainly is biased. And again, someone's put bias in particular racial. Yep. Ethnicity, religion should not be used. Yep, fully agree. Like I said, they're protected characteristics. You really need to have an extremely good reason and justification to use that type of data, and I don't think this necessarily is. I think the final one is self-fulfilling prophecy. The data's already skewed, and they've linked it to that first comment, and yeah, I definitely agree. If you start trying to predict who's likely to reoffend based on what's happened in the past, you're almost treating people in a sense they've done their time. They should be free citizens now, and you're going to start profiling them as likely reoffenders based on something in the past. It's not really the most ethical thing to do, I would argue. And again, this is based on a real example. So there was a study done in the US to look at recidivism predictions, and when they actually produced an output, as was put on the mirror board, there was some seriously skewed outputs. So there's a much higher false positive rate for black people than white people, and there's white defendants were at much lower risk of being mislabeled than black defendants. I think the really interesting thing about this example, though, is I think the team had actually excluded the racial characteristics from the data, and yet still the model picked up on racial disparities. So I think that's why in the framework I talk so much about testing and validation. Like, you think you've excluded the important characteristics, the protected characteristics. How do you know that there still isn't a pattern that an AI is going to pick up, that just because you can't see it as a human, how do you know an AI won't somehow pick it up?
Yeah, because some other features may be a proxy for the same thing.
Exactly, yeah, because these biases in the data go a lot deeper than just what's in that column what's in that ethnicity column. So that's why I think testing, retesting, validating is so important. The other thing I was going to draw attention to is the accuracy rate is 61%. That doesn't seem great to me. So I think arguably you probably can't do what they're trying to do fairly. The only way to do it effectively would probably be extremely unfair and just recreate the past disparities that are in the data, which is maybe it would be accurate on the test set, but that is probably not going to be fair in real life. Okay, the next scenario is about bias. So you're in a recruitment team at a large tech company, and you receive so many resumes a day, it's impossible to screen all of them effectively. The company you're working for wants to automate it and develop some sort of resume screening engine that will rate candidates, point recruiters towards the best rated candidates, and then your team's only focusing on the people that you think are likely to be hired. The company has data on all the resumes that have been submitted over a 10-year period starting from 2015 and going back to 2005, and including the outcomes of those submissions. So you've got whether this person was hired, whether the firm rejected them, whether they rejected the firm. I guess the question for this one is what type of biases are hiding in this data, and hopefully the bolding on the slide is an effective prompt as to what those biases are likely to be, if it wasn't completely obvious, to be fair. There's a sticky that says diversity out the window, which, that is bang on, I think.
Mm. Mm. Mm.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to start going through these now, and again, I'll do it clockwise. So starting in the top right, and sorry, you're already typing, but hopefully you'll finish typing before I finish speaking. Certain prior educational institutions and places of work will create strong biases. Institutions with higher prior acceptance rate will be reinforced. Those institutions are likely to favour wealthy candidates, and those with homogenous upbringing making a less diverse workforce. Yeah, that's completely right. So this model is probably going to go, what have we recruited in the past? Mm-hmm. Therefore, let's recruit that in the future. And we all know for a fact that, especially in the tech industry, there are a lot of, I guess, diversity disparities in the workforce that
Mm-hmm.
are that this is likely to reinforce. And like the commenter has said, it's likely going to favour people of a particular socio-economic background with a particular upbringing, and you're just going to hire more and more of that type of person. And I don't think that's beneficial for the company. It's certainly not beneficial for the candidates. Even if it will save you some time, I really don't think it's worth it. The next one, only hiring the same types of people. Yep, basically same exact point. You're just going to hire what you've hired before. You'll just be sat in a room full of people that look, sound, and grew up like you, which is like my personal nightmare. Teams in tech tend to be very homogenous. Yep. So you're just gonna recruit people that are literally the same as you. People are gonna feel like they need to fit in because everyone is the same, has come from the same place. Probably people won't want to come to your company when they walk around, come to visit, do an interview, and see literally everyone here is the same person. Class gap, tech education is still not accessible. Yep, that's completely right. Just because someone doesn't have a qualification or a university degree doesn't necessarily mean they aren't up for the job. And this type of product is just going to reinforce those type of biases. The data set's outdated. Yep, it's really out of date. And it's probably going to give some really odd recommendations. And the next one, racial, gender, etc. Yep, completely right. We know there's disparities in the tech workforce, especially diversity out the window. Yep. You will not be giving your recruiters a diverse portfolio of CVs if you do this. You get the same people over and over, no fresh blood. Yeah, that's the same. Miss out on the skills needed for new opportunities in the business. Yeah, I think if you're thinking about should we do this from the standpoint of an organization, definitely you should not do this because you want to recruit new people, you want to have new thoughts, new ideas. You don't want to use what you've done in the past to do the same in the future. So even before you think about the ethics, I don't think this really necessarily makes business sense. And again, there is I've got a real life scenario to go with this. So Amazon developed a recruitment engine based on historical data, and if you look at the charts, there was an aggressive skew towards men, as you'd expect, because the tech industry is historically and still today male dominated. So the recommendations it made put male individuals of a specific socio-economic background to the front, and subsequently those are the recommendations they were getting. And clearly there was a lot of public blowback at this. It was not deemed acceptable. So I think that's another one which is clearly biased. I think again this is where the framework can come in handy. So if you're doing your exploratory data analysis, if you're talking to the data owners to understand what biases are in the data, what that we should be aware of, you should know up front that there's issues with this data and either be able to come up with a mitigation strategy. So how can we undo the skew? How can we sample this? So we're getting stuff from the more recent resume pool, maybe pulling new data that's more up to date, but developing various strategies to try and combat that bias, because we know there's going to be some really good candidates that this will miss.
Mm.
So last set of scenarios, and I put these all on one slide because they're a little bit more straightforward. So these are all about accountability. So the first question is: a healthcare provider purchases...
Oh, hang on. Sorry for interrupting. There is a question in the chat.
Oh, sorry.
How would you tackle this problem? Is AI in a form able to help out on the example?
Yeah, so how would I tackle this problem? I think what I already said, really. So I would try, if we really felt as a team that we wanted to do this, I would try my hardest to find new data, up-to-date data.
Mm-hmm.
I would try my hardest to challenge the data and see, is it possible to create good outcomes while combating the skews that are in this data.
Mm-hmm.
And if we found that no matter what we do, we can't make predictions that aren't leaning towards certain groups, then I would say we just don't do this, because I think the risk to the firm is very high, not just reputationally, but you're just going to hire the same types of people, and you're just going to get the same thoughts, and you're going to miss out on some brilliant candidates for the sake of investing a little bit more in your recruitment team, and propping that up with some more hands to go through all the CVs. I mean, I think one thing organisations should do, like I said at the start, is should we use AI to do this? Well, are there other things you could do to your recruitment process to make it more effective? Like, are there checks you could do? Is there extra screening you could do so you're only getting the candidates that you really think are worth your time? I don't think that AI should be used for this specific scenario, unless, like I said, you can really kind of rigorously combat the skew in the data.
Yeah, one trick we sometimes use is to add noise to the output. So yes, you have 80% of the time you get the model output, 20% of the time you just get a random one.
Yeah.
Just to make sure that you keep an eye on what's happening in reality, in society.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. Okay, so the last set of scenarios. So first one is: a healthcare provider purchases an AI-powered healthcare application that provides a clinician with an erroneous diagnosis. So I guess this app is like predicting diagnoses for a patient, or saying what the diagnosis is based on what they've told us, and that doctor carries out that procedure mistakenly. Who is ultimately accountable for that error? And yeah, please put the tickets in the board, and if you have any additional thoughts about this as a use case, please feel free to share. Someone's put my name. I am personally responsible for anything that goes wrong with AI globally. The doctor is getting some serious heat in this mirror board.
It's his fault.
It's good to see. Yeah.
Also a healthcare provider.
Yeah. Okay, I'll start going through these, and as always, feel free to keep typing. So the first in the top right is me. I think that's wrong. I didn't do this, and I never would do this. So I'm going to reject that one. The doctor is ultimately accountable for the procedure. Yeah, I think if we go back to implementation fairness, is the team aware of what they're doing, what the framework says about what they're doing, and how these outcomes are being developed, and the data that's being used, and the risks that are posed? And a clinician is in charge of the patient's care, and they're the expert, so they should be the final line of validation before you do something. So I think, to an extent, they are accountable for this. But I think, we'll go through all the stickies. The product and the doctor are both accountable, presumably a board of professionals certified the app. These will be, so I agree with that. So not only is the doctor accountable for the mistake, probably the product team are also accountable. They've pushed a product into the live environment that can, that has errors in it. I would say that it's probably impossible to develop a solution that will never have errors, but I think that's where like I said, the doctor comes in. They should be that final line of validation to make sure that they've seen this procedure, and they've met the patient. They should probably do some last minute checks and not do a procedure if it sounds a bit fishy to them. The next sticky is the hospital. So yeah, I agree. The hospital's also got to be accountable. They've bought the app, or they've built the app. They should have tested the app. They should have validated the app, and they definitely shouldn't be putting in a process where procedures could be carried out by a clinician without the clinician taking that extra step of due diligence to make sure what they've done is right. All the above. I think this is an interesting one, because I would say that potentially the manufacturer has some obligation to hand over a product that gives the right outcome. But I guess it's this one's probably slightly debatable, which is why I asked the question, because I guess the manufacturer might say, we tested it, we stated that it was 95% accurate, we've documented what we've done, how we've done it. So if the manufacturer has applied fairness by design and agent mapping and all the principles effectively, yes, I guess they might have some kind of legal obligation in the contract, but ultimately it's the who's deploying the product, who's working with the customer, the citizen. I would say they're the most accountable, but yeah, potentially the manufacturer does share some of that accountability. And I haven't got these examples to hand, but there are many examples, I think, from the US of developers, manufacturers being sued because the products they developed and sold to people, created errors that were carried out. So the next one is healthcare provider for not introducing cross-validation. Canonical coders were, so I agree, the healthcare provider shouldn't be using this solution unless they've fully validated it, and they certainly shouldn't be using it to determine procedures unless they can say hand on heart, we can explain everything that's coming out of this, and we're this sure, but and the doctor's going to check as a last point. Shouldn't someone check that manually-ish before a procedure? Yes, I agree. I think just because you use AI doesn't mean the whole process has to be automated. You can use AI to do the 80% of simple things, and then in the 20% you hand it over to a human, or the AI makes a guess and a human checks it. I don't think it's necessary that AI has to fully automate everything. It can support a human, and I think in this scenario it definitely should. Human in the loop, so I think that's the same point really. There has in this scenario there should be a human involved. There was a sticky note which says what is meant by accountable. I guess the question was who when this mistake is getting challenged by the citizen, who has to stand up and say, yeah, that's my fault. This is what we did and where it went wrong, and this is how we're going to fix it.
Interesting.
Okay, the next question is, we have a driverless car with a human operator on board, and the car crashes into another car due to a failure in the AI system. Who's accountable for this? So we have a car manufacturer, we have a driver of the car, an operator of the car who's on board, and it's crashed into another car. Who's accountable for that error? Going to give it another minute. Okay, I'm going to start going through these. So again, first in the top right, the creators of the AI are accountable in all scenarios. However, if the AI was sold on the pretense that the driver must override the control of the vehicle in case of error, the driver will also be somewhat accountable depending on the scenario and failure. I think I broadly agree with this, depending on what you mean by creators. Because if it was created by a company and sold to another company, then I think the company that bought and deployed the product is more accountable than the actual creators. But if we assume that the car manufacturer is also the creator, then yes, I would agree. If you're creating this software and you're deciding to put it into production, even if you have a human operator, you are still, that, like I said, the accountability should go to the top. You should have a board that sits in front of it, and they are the ultimate accountable people for it. I would say yes, the driver possibly faces some level of accountability because they're supposed to be there to override it, but I think the majority of the accountability sits on the creator, sits on the firm. Sorry. Depends on the contracts. Yeah, I guess it does. I guess that goes to that point about who produced the AI, who bought it. But in this scenario, I should have probably been more clear. Let's assume the manufacturer produced the AI themselves, and they have some contract there that the operator is there to override in the case of failure. Next one says no one act of God. Yeah, I mean, I guess I didn't specify whose fault the car crash was. That's a good point. Next one is maybe the road. Yeah, again, I should have said in this scenario on a perfectly flat road with complete visibility. But yeah, it's a good point. The manufacturer of the AI as car manufacturer could have outsourced. Yeah, I think that's a good point. Who has the manufacturer outsourced the AI to someone else? But even in that case, I would say whoever's doing the outsourcing is still ultimately responsible. Next one is not driver. Yep, I think already covered that. They're part responsible for this for sure. But again, I think the ultimate accountability goes to the owner of the car, the firm. This is the reason why a driverless car is an extreme risk, as humans will always tend towards relaxing and letting the tool do the job. Yeah, so I think that's a really good point. When you're asking, should we do this? Should we have driverless taxis? There is a massive risk there. So I think you have to be pretty certain when you're validating, your tests, when you're doing your QA, that this sort of thing won't happen. And if it does happen, that the people you're putting in the car with the override ability are aware of their responsibility and know how to do it. And that goes back to that implementation fairness concept and the design fairness concept, that you've decided to do this risky thing, and these are the risks that you're aware of, that the car could crash, the human in the loop could not do their job, or could be distracted, or could be impaired, and therefore you've got the best possible person in the car ready to do the override if the worst should happen. The car insurance firm, yeah, they're probably going to take a bit of heat in this case. I would have said. In some jurisdictions, you cannot exclude all liabilities. Yep, that's definitely true. I think so. This is based based somewhat on a real example. So there is a taxi firm in the US that had a driverless car experiment, and this literally happened. And the firm itself was found responsible and hit with a massive fine. I think the only thing I would add to all these questions, to all these answers, is probably the regulator takes some share of the blame here. How have they allowed a system that could go this wrong onto the road? But it really depends on the country in that case, and how the regulatory body works, because possibly the company passed all the regulations that were set, but you might argue that should this type of technology be allowed on the road until it has 99% pass rate type of thing.
Yeah, well, if it passes a driving test, how worse are they than human
Exactly.
drivers?
Yeah, exactly. I think that's actually what they argued in that case, that the fail rate was still lower than a human. But if you haven't been testing it long enough, how do you truly know that? And like I said, when the risk is this great, maybe that isn't enough to justify doing this. Okay, so last scenario, and this is a slightly tricky one, I think. So this is called the problem of many hands. Imagine you are developing an AI solution at the end of a seriously complex supply chain of data where data has been collected from multiple sources, enriched at different points and in different ways, but before it ever got to your team. Your team then builds an algorithm on top of that data that produces a decision that a citizen or a customer goes, I don't agree with this, tell me why you did that. How would you actually go about explaining something like that, considering the supply chain? I'll give it one more minute, but seeing lots of good comments on the board. I think whoever's putting orange sticky notes has figured out that I always start in the top right, so that they can go first. So I'm going to counter that by...
Is that ethical though?
Yeah, I'm going to counter that by starting in the bottom left. First comment in the bottom left was understanding how the algorithm works. Yes, so the entire framework that we designed is entirely about documenting what you're doing, why you're doing it, how it's being done, and being able very good. It's being moved, and being able to stand in front of it and be totally transparent with anyone that's interested to be able to say, look, here's, this is what we're doing, this is why we're doing it, and this is what the data has, how the data came to us, and what happened to it, and et cetera, et cetera. So you should have explain the risks to the upstream data providers. They're also responsible. Yeah, I think this is a good point. So when you're in ideation stage and you're sourcing data and you're filling in your DPIA, you should be explaining to people, this is what we're doing and why we're doing it, because they kind of, they're the data owners. They should be responsible for the data, and they should be able to tell you, this is the data. These are the risks with it. This is what we've done to it when we got it, or maybe they collected it at source, and these are the things you need to be aware of if you want to use it for this use case. Next, not by saying it is their fault. Yeah, agree. It's not a blame game. It's a what went wrong, how do we fix it, kind of thing. You should be using data that's well documented. Yes, I agree with this actually. So you should only use data that's well documented. I guess in the real world, we all know that data is not often well documented, and I think this is, and a couple of people already pointed it out, this is where that agent mapping thing comes in handy. So data won't be well documented, so you need to make sure that you fulfilled your obligation to the citizen, the customer, by going, this is what it was given to us, this is what we know was done to it, or this is the extent to which these are the gaps in our knowledge, and just being transparent about it. The next one is, this should be accounted for from the start of the project. Yes, for sure. And I think that goes back to the question Willem asked, when should you think about ethics? And I said, the entire time. So, you should be documenting what's happening to the data and how you're getting to your end results. This agent thing you discussed, yep, exactly. So I think this problem is fixed very nicely by agent mapping. If you have that visual map ready and you can go, here you go, this is the journey from the data that was collected from you to the model. These are all the people that touched it and what they did at a high level, and these are the areas that had an impact on the decision and how important they were. Maybe not do this yet. I think if you're faced with that kind of complexity, if it's a super risky use case, it's maybe not worth doing, because if you can't explain something when it gets challenged, then you will be in a lot of trouble. With full transparency, heterogeneous data is good, but must be justified and fit within the question. Yep, totally agree with that, and I think that kind of echoes the previous points. You've got to be transparent about what you've done. It's good to get lots of sources, but you have to be able to justify why you used it and how it fits the actual problem you're trying to solve. And then I think the final one, it would be unethical to have created the algorithm without already understanding the prior chain of data. Yes, I totally agree with that. If you can't at the end of your ideation cycle say, this is the data we're using, this is why we're using it, this is what's been done to it, then I think you're already in a tricky situation before you've even started proper work. Presuming the algorithm was created ethically, the creators know the full extent of the prior data and can explain this to the customer as well as their own decision with respect to their own algorithm. Yeah, again, agree. If you cannot explain this efficiently to a customer, then you probably have bigger problems internally with the algorithm also. Yeah, so I totally agree with that. If you can't, if you're building an algorithm on a data set that you can't explain, then like you really need to be challenging what you're doing. Like that first question, should we do this? Probably not. If you can't, if you're already starting from a point where you don't understand the data that you're using, you're already in deep water, and you either need to get the data owners to tell you what has been done to this data, or you need to think, are there other better data sources we could use, or do we need to invest some time with this data owner, get some of our own data engineers and domain specialists to help them do the mapping, because this use case is just so valuable and so good. That's everything. So cool. Thanks everyone for your time and for contributing to the scenarios. I hope it was helpful.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks. And the final point I definitely learned is, well, you need to always challenge. Do I understand the data that I get? Do I understand the implications of any issues with that? But also, that's fine, but also does the provider of that data understand the data? And do they understand the consequence and how we are using their data?
Yep.
So it's a full supply chain. Well, Steve, thank you very much. I thought it was really cool. I like the interactiveness in the end. It brought out some key points. So thanks for that. I'll be just quickly for the audience, we'll do another one of those in about a month's time. Back to some really technical challenges. We'll have Spiros talk about hidden Markov chains, and I asked him to go all the way into the nooks and crannies of nooks and crannies. What's the word? Anyways, deep into the details. That's in a month's time. You'll see the invite coming. Be free and share the links into the Real Data Science meetups. We now have 3 meetups, one, the generic one, which is based in the Utrecht office. We have the London office, that's about 180 people, and we've just started the Denver office as well. And we'll be looking at live events after the summer. So be free and share the links. We're happy for anyone to join us. Thanks again, Steve.
Thank you.
And see you in a month's time.